welcome back to Bridgeworks. This session is called From Them to Us, and it means to help you understand the way in which Paul recognized the union between Gentile Christians and Jewish believers in the Roman Church. I'm standing today in front of a grafted tree. A grafted tree is one that combines two different plants, and often plants from two different species, into one stronger organism. If you look closely, you can see that there are two different kinds of branches that are growing together as one plant. It's really cool. People have actually known about tree grafting for 4,000 years or so. And by the time that Paul wrote Romans, it was a common practice around the Mediterranean world and the Near East. There are lots of different reasons why plant grafts happen. In addition to simply creating a more beautiful tree like we have here, there are practical considerations that go into grafting as well. For instance, you could create a plant that is hardier in extreme weather conditions, or one that's more resistant to pests. Some trees, like apple trees, are even grafted so that the trees will be shorter and there's less potential of injury to human harvesters. In any case, grafting requires the bringing together of a strong root system, which is called the stalk, and a healthy leaf or fruit component, which is called the scion. In Romans chapter 11, Paul compares the Roman church to a grafted olive tree. That image would have been one with long and meaningful connotations to the Jewish believers. All the way back to Jeremiah 11, God referred to his community of people as, quote, a green olive tree, beautiful and bearing good fruit, close quote. But now, here in Rome, Gentiles have been grafted into that olive tree, into that community, and a new organism, a new community of believers was growing up together there. In many cases, with olive trees specifically, an olive tree grafting involved taking a wild root system, a wild stock, which was strong in its grip on the native land, and then grafting in a beautiful, cultivated, fruit-bearing branch. And that new tree would have the best of both worlds, sturdy at the base and plentiful in its branches. But in Romans, Paul does something surprising. He flips the script. Because Paul says that the ingrafted Gentiles are like the wild olive branch. Here, a sort of opposite spiritual horticulture is taking place. The wild outsider is taking the place of the naturally growing branches. Now, what does this mean? What is this referring to? Well, what Paul is saying is that there is a long and deep and lasting root of Jewish faith that exists in Christianity. That legacy includes people like Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Esther. And that tree should have flourished at a new way, to a new level when Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah, came. But here's what happened. Paul noticed that many of his Jewish colleagues rejected Jesus. And Paul says that when they did, it's almost as if they were broken off from God's great, grand olive tree. It's like the naturally born branches were snapped away, and they were no longer part of that family. And now, Paul says, the Gentiles, the Greeks and Romans and others, have come in to take their place in the tree. These wild branches grew up elsewhere, in other faith traditions, and they grew up as people of different ethnicities. But God has grafted them into the tree, and they are now part of the ancient faith that has culminated in the coming of Jesus. And Paul wants them to know new things are emerging and flourishing as a result of this graft. In the Old Testament, this happened in a really cool way with Ruth. Ruth was a Gentile who was grafted into the Jewish family, and as a result, King David grew up as part of that ancient olive tree. Amazing things happen when God grafts. Now, Paul says a little bit later in the chapter that this happened, that Gentiles are being grafted into the ancient Jewish tree in part to make those broken off branches envious, so that they, these Jewish people, might ultimately return to the tree of their root. And Paul says that accepting Jesus as their Messiah will help them to assimilate easily into the tree from which they first grew. And Paul also warns in this chapter the Gentiles, those who've been grafted in, that they can just as easily be snapped off if they don't persist in God's kindness. They have to be faithful, or there's a chance that they too can be snapped off from the tree. Ultimately, Paul says, God is in the business, in a sort of spiritual gardening that involves bringing new people into the family of faith. God is always grafting, always introducing those who trust in Jesus into the ancient olive tree of salvation. Now, with any graft, there's cutting involved. There's wrapping that's involved. Grafts involve breaking off and new healing. But ultimately, the tree becomes stronger than ever. As a Gentile myself, I'm thankful for this. I am humbled and grateful to be part of the grafted family of God. And I want to be myself on the lookout, eagerly and expectantly to see who else God will unite into his incredible and ancient olive tree.